Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you today featuring Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's been senator from Rhode Island since 2007. And for our purposes, most importantly, a true thought leader in going after Russian dark money. Russian dark money is the world's largest source of such money, approximately $1 trillion. Burrowed safely, sadly to say, in mainly the United States and Great Britain. We have with us to interview Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Julia Friedlander, who is she is the senior director, a director in the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center for Economic Statecraft. And I apologize, Julia, for fumbling that. But more importantly, she's about the smartest analyst around when it comes to dark money and, for that matter, sanctions. So, Julia, over to you.
Thank you, John. And regardless of title, I am honored to welcome Senator Whitehouse to discuss a very hot topic today, and one, of course, that has been close to my heart since my days in the Treasury Department, and that is Russian dark money and how the United States can and will go after it. So it's a pleasure to speak with you. I hope to bring in audience questions here, so please use the Q&A function. And after a few questions of my own, I will turn to you to ask questions of the senator as well. So I'll just start this off with a question that's becoming rather clear to us over the past couple of weeks, but one that, of course, I've been following and Senator, you've been following for years, which is why is Russian dark money a national security threat to the United States? Why aren't we just viewing Russians as just tax evaders like many others? And why should the United States government be focusing on this from a national security perspective?
Well, I guess largely put, my view is that to misparaphrase Samuel Huntington, we actually are in a clash of civilizations, but the clash is different than the one he proposed. It's between rule of law countries and non-rule of law countries, oligarchies, autocracies, criminal enterprises. And in that battle, we unfortunately are giving a lot of aid and comfort to our enemies, because what the oligarchs and the criminals and the autocrats love, once they've done looting their countries, is to find someplace safe to put their money. They don't want the next biggest looter and autocrat to come and scoop everything that they stole. So they seek the protection of rule of law for their ill-gotten gains. But in order to do that effectively, they also have to do it anonymously so that they can't be chased down. And that's where little daylight into all of this has a big national security imperative. Because if you look at all the evil things that have happened in the world in the last couple of decades, an enormous amount of it has developed on the other side of that boundary in this clash of civilizations. We're not being threatened by rule of law countries. We're being threatened by things that happen in non-rule of law countries, and the more we can pinch that off by not allowing the people who rule them to take advantage of rule of law systems, the better off we are. That's kind of the big picture. When you get to Russia, you see that Putin has been enabled by, and in turn enables, a crew of corrupt oligarchs who help make sure that democracy doesn't happen and he can threaten his people and act independently of Russian popular will, and who also help him hide and steal assets for himself. And that little cabal of thieves we need to disrupt, both because it's what led to the decision-making that put Russia into Ukraine, and because by putting pressure on them, you actually put indirect pressure on Putin. It's probably one of the most painful ways we can apply counter pressure to Vladimir Putin is by squeezing the hell out of his corrupt oligarchs and all their crooked assets, and they in turn put the squeeze on him and say, "Hey, this isn't so much fun anymore. You gotta help us out here." Remember the original round in Ukraine when the oligarchs panicked and shoved out the pre-Maidan government.
Sure. I mean, I think that, it's one thing to, to argue that these are pilfered assets that are essentially the Russian state and the goods of the Russian people, but also that these assets can be used for malicious activities, right? You can argue that these sources of money are, if these oligarchs are instruments of Putin's regime, then they're also potentially redirecting them to counter our foreign policy objectives elsewhere.
Yeah, where deniability is important to Vladimir Putin, he can basically use the oligarchs and use other front groups to distance himself from individual acts of evil that he is doing and then pretend that he's not behind them.
Why do you think that it's taken us so long to make the connection?
I hate to say this, but a lot of Americans have made a lot of money servicing this international dark economy. When we started with the beneficial ownership law that actually finally passed into law and the Treasury is implementing right now to clean up the American shell corporation mess, we ran afoul first of the US Chamber of Commerce. And then when their membership said, wait a minute, what the hell are you doing? And backed them off, then stood up the American Bar Association until their membership stood up and said, wait a minute, what the hell are you doing? And then the National Federation of Independent Businesses stepped up in sequence to be our next adversary. And they couldn't make a very good case. So we basically got the law passed despite them. But behind the effort to step up the chamber against us, to step up the Bar Association against us, and to step up the NFIB against us are a lot of folks who make a hell of a lot of money, whether they're realtors or whether they're hedge fund operators or whether they're yacht brokers in servicing this corrupt economy.
Sure. I mean, that's true. And I agree with that. But I would also say it's maybe also a question of how do we consider illicit assets as being, and money laundering as being less of a, law enforcement function than also a national security one. I mean, and this is leading up to the next question I'll ask you.
I agree with that. This isn't a do-gooder thing. This is a national security thing. And if we think of it only as like international do-gooding, then we're missing the real point and the real danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, when I was what struck me though, when I was in Treasury though, that there was also this sort of foreign aspect, right? This is the powers of the US Treasury Department are sanctions abroad, right? But if it had to do with the domestic side, it had to do, I was like, oh no, Julia, the FBI will take this from you now. And then you heard nothing more because there was this divide between foreign and domestic. I guess, what are some of the challenges you think that are inherent in, either from your perspective, congressional perspective, but also in the executive branch in actually pursuing dark money, besides, beneficial ownership being one of them?
Well, I think some of it's been institutional, and I have to commend the Biden administration because I think the Biden administration prioritizing this in its democracy initiative raises it up as a national security priority in ways that then move other agencies of government, National Security Council and so forth, to give this more credence and to invest more effort into it. I also think that the klepto capture effort and the transatlantic task force that have been announced to go after Russian oligarchs will help breathe more life into FinCEN, DOJ's kleptocracy initiative, and the State Department sanctions group that haven't been as robustly engaged and as engaged together as I think they could have been. So those two areas of significant presidential leadership, I think, are going to pay significant dividends at cutting through some of the kind of interagency process clutter that slows this down.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that there's a sort of a chicken and egg problem with this sometimes, right? Where it's like everybody has a little piece of it, but someone has to set the priorities. And I think that Biden did that. Right, by his press release. I'm going to start asking some questions from the audience and just sort of, take us through a little bit what the process in the United States is of freezing and potentially seizing assets. Right, we like to talk about it. Say. It's politically satisfying to say we've frozen the yacht right in the harbor, right? Yeah. But that's sort of the very beginning, maybe the easiest thing. So, I mean, maybe you can give us a little bit of an impression of why operationally this can be so difficult.
Well, First of all, I think you've got to put enough resources at it so that you're, leaning really forward and have the capacity to do a lot. It's not clear to me that anybody in the United States government knew where all the oligarch yachts were. And were prepared to, with an admiralty filing, hold the vessel in place long enough to do the rest of the work necessary. Putin was able to get what appears to be his own yacht out of Hamburg and up into Russian waters without any of us really having anything to do or say about it. So I think, we've got to lean a lot more forward. We've got to be willing to move on a lot less information. If you see this as a lawyer, if you see this as kind of an asset seizure thing, then you go through the enormous, the Cypriot bank account to the Cayman Islands Corporation to the other shell fund. And by the time you've created all of that, you've slowed yourself down a lot. I want to see the DNI involved so that if Intel tells us that we believe this yacht, this mansion, this airplane is owned by this oligarch, we can go and presumptively seize it or freeze it, and then sort out the ultimate proof at the end of the day, but not lose the asset while you're trying to build the very complex case through all of the screens that they've set up to try to prevent that from happening. We often know well enough that this is actually this guy's thing that we should be able to, and we should be teed up to grab it then, and then let the real owner, if there is some different real owner, show up and say, no, it's actually me. I think what you'll find is that we'll right 99% of the time, and we've saved a lot of trouble and seized a lot of assets, and nothing is going to make me happier than to see auctions of this property with the funds going to Ukrainian relief.
How does that happen, though? I mean, what is the legal basis for this in the United States context, right? Because you could, the legal standard for sanctions is very different than for seizure, right? Under U.S. law. So, what is what are we going after these guys under? Money laundering? I mean, I think that would be great, but you have to, in order the timeline, between when we presumptive freeze on property and a forfeiture procedure, right, could be years.
Yeah, and that's the issue we're confronting. I think that between presidential emergency powers and presidential war powers, given the extent to which going after these oligarchs is directed at the national security imperative of trying to back Putin and Russia off in the beginnings of what might be a European land war, I think we need to think of this not in terms of just pure legalistic dotting T's and dotting I's and crossing T's, but in terms of exerting the maximum authority that the president is allowed to grab and seize, and then fill in the details later on, because again, 99% of the time you're gonna be right. And the bill that we're working on right now that may be agreed finally as quickly as today provides the kind of authorization that we think is required to the maximum sort of foreign policy executive determination limits that the president enjoys. When you have a botnet running, you're very often obliged by law to give notice before you shut down the botnet. And what we've discovered is that when you actually file that notice to the world, nobody comes forward, because when they come forward, they're confessing. Mm-hmm. And so you've cleared the legalities of it, you shut down the botnet, and you go on to cleaning up the next one. I think this would be a little bit like that. I think the intel would likely be accurate, and they'd be hard pressed to manufacture a sham owner who we couldn't blow up as a sham owner in a full-on legal proceeding with proper discovery. So leaning way forward in the foxhole, I think, is important.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. I think that's useful, perhaps, for our audience to understand that there are the legal intricacies of this have held us up in the past. So maybe just to give us a little bit more color about what would happen in this ideal scenario, right? How would you see? We have a question here asking about who decides about happens and who decides about the disposition of seized or frozen assets, right? What would be your according to the pending legislation, or maybe your own ideal scenario, what would happen with these assets?
Well, we're still working on it in terms of what we can get agreement on, and this is all happening, as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit premature to say, but there is very strong bipartisan support for allowing the president the authority to authorize the United States government and or our allies to freeze and, where appropriate, seize assets belonging to oligarchs, and then have a proceeding to finally determine ownership and disposition. And then it becomes, an asset of the United States, and we can decide whether it's like Iranian assets just held and subject to claims of people who've already developed litigation and may have actually pending judgments, or whether we, again, lean a little bit more forward and determine that the use of the proceeds should be to support Ukrainian relief. That is a policy decision that I think we're entitled to make either way or both ways, and also to leave some executive flexibility given the international overtones of all of this and the need to have executive flexibility to use this as an effective tool in complex, fast-moving, multi-party circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And do you foresee this functioning mainly in the Russia context, or is this a special scenario that we're in, or would it be potentially applicable to others around the world? Are we setting a global precedent here?
I hope so. To me, this is a teachable moment, and I think it's teachable in two respects. First, I think people now really understand that corrupt oligarchs aren't just morally offensive and bad people who steal, but they create enormous dangers in the world, and they create enormous national security risks for the United States of America. And we have a national security imperative to deal with this systemically. Not a lot of people saw that before. I think this made it very, very clear. And the second is, when you're doing that, we don't really have the most aggressive and clear tools at our disposal. And we weren't as thoroughly organized to make this a priority as we could have been. And I think the focus through the kleptocracy initiative and the transatlantic task force is going to really make our investigative and enforcement effort much, much more rapid and robust, so that we can be moving in real time and with real effect to win these battles and put the kind of pressure on that we need to try to discourage Putin and his oligarchs from getting too far down the road in Ukraine with their brutalities.
I mean, I'm certainly going to ask you about the international element of it, but I guess I'm curious also how you see this dovetailing with global Magnitsky, because we have used those authorities to target those corrupt capture around the world. These are sanctions again, right?
Yep.
But it's been I'm not going to I don't want to sort of throw my former colleagues under the bus a little bit. It's a little random who we've ended up sanctioning, right? It's
Yep.
a little bit here, it's a little bit there. How does this become how do you see this becoming an overall overall tenet of the global democracy program that the administration has put together? I mean, anti-kleptocracy was, I think, the biggest actionable point out of the December summit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that policy determination and the role of the National Security Council in pursuing it sets up very well to improve our performance in that space at the general level. And I think the kleptocracy initiative and the transatlantic task force operationalize a lot of this much more efficiently. And I think between those two, we can then take a much broader strategic look at what our targeting should be and how much more broadly we should cast our targeting net and what our priority should be once we have resources targeted, and turn this thing into a much more effective, robust, policy-driven, and less sporadic enterprise. And I think if we do that, we will degrade the offshore dark economy in ways that will be very, very important for our national security and frankly for our reputation around the globe. I mean, we're not supposed to be Cayman Islands 2.0. We're supposed to be the United States of America. And the idea that somebody loots a country and everybody's looking around for hospitals and roads and there's nothing there because their country got looted and they're sporting on Park Avenue in a penthouse and have US shell corporations hiding their money, that's not a good look for America. And I think turning that around is going to be important too.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, maybe you could give a little more color about what that looks like, with the North Dakotas and the Nevadas out there.
Yeah, well, we still need to have the Treasury finish the beneficial ownership work and make sure that it reaches as far as it can. I think geographical targeting order expansion to cover more real estate practices. And if we can't get to the Dakota Trust through this, then we have to take that as a next step. But I think once we've determined that this is a national security imperative and we have strengthened the apparatus to make that effective, then addressing these other problems becomes much easier. Again, it's not just sporadic, it's not just episodic. We have a actual strategy and a plan, and we're deploying it. And we've got a goal, and we achieve it better when we're that organized and that focused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a question in the chat, and it just occurred to me as you were just speaking about how much of this is congressional versus executive versus local, right? Because this is also a question of state regulators and state law enforcement, right? It's not just us sitting here in Washington and saying, this is our priority, guys, right? Yeah. How does that get communicated? How does it pass?
The first people we had to work through on the beneficial ownership bill were local officials in Delaware and Nevada. And we did, and that was part of how the bill became successful. But yeah, and particularly I think the Dakota trusts are important to that state from a revenue perspective in the same way that corporate entities in Delaware were important to the state of Delaware. But again, you make this a national security imperative. You explain to people what the hazards are of not knowing who's behind the trust. What if it's Vladimir Putin? What if it's one of his oligarchs? What if it's the Iranian government? Those are things that are important to know. And that gives us, I think, more leverage to move forward and get that information to FinCEN, to our State Department, and if necessary, even to DOD.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I completely agree with you, Senator. I think, this is it's a bit of a revolution in money laundering world, right? Because if you sit in the financial action task force land, especially, this is a functional issue, right? This is an issue of sort of like due diligence and good governance. It's not an issue that bleeds over into this messy world of intelligence and military. And that's scary stuff, right? And so how do you, it's sort of beyond the scope of your everyday compliance officer, and maybe
which is what's so exciting about this moment, because I think we're over that Rubicon. And now it's a question of implementing and making it work and deploying it. But as somebody who's been banging at this for a long, long time, to have the gateway suddenly open and have the democracy initiative out there, have the kleptocracy initiative out there, have the international recognition of the importance of defeating oligarchy corruption happening around the globe. This is a really huge change point, and it's very exciting, but it's also going to take a lot of work to implement and get it right. But great moment to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a little more about the transatlantic task force. I've been on a lot of transatlantic task forces myself, and sometimes they say they are more than what they actually are. So what do you think this is going to look like?
Well, I think the first step is for the US, which I gather we're doing right now, to pull the sanctions unit in the State Department, FinCEN in Treasury, and the kleptocracy initiative in DOJ together and backstop them with whatever they need to get out of DNI in terms of ownership information and location information of assets, and get our own act together and make it really robust. And while we're doing that, also be working with our European allies, again, find, fix, and seize as many assets as they can. And because of where things are, it's very important to have local support and people who understand local laws. What kind of liens can you use with admiralty jurisdiction to hold a vessel while you sort out the rest? Where are places where our diplomats can tell us that we're not going to get the affirmative approval of the local government, but if we just go ahead and did this, that, or the other, they would let us go ahead without complaint, and kind of work the problem that way. But I think the first thing is going to be to try to do a better job of identifying where assets are located. And I think a lot of that is an intel function more than trying to break through the wall of a Cypriot bank secrecy rule, which leads you to a Cayman Island shell corporation, which leads you in turn to a Dakota trust. And you get lost in all that. But people live in these houses, or they, go there and they have parties on the yachts, and we can put that information together and I think speed it up a lot. And I think that's the process of combining the information together and figuring out what the local legal opportunities and options are so that we can deploy aggressively across multiple jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I'm also a former Intel analyst, so I would certainly agree with that approach, right? You'd say go from the Intel and you build out from there. But I guess this just leads me to a two-part question, and part of it we can't really talk about on a Zoom. But like, do we think we have the resources we need, and do we think that our allies have the resources that they need? Because a lot of times when I talk about this problem in Europe, it's considered in terms of tax evasion, right? So this is tax evasion. It's not crime, money laundering. And it's not a national security threat. It's tax evasion. And there's still discussions in European levels to sort of try to, get at this through tax law. So that's not an intelligence equity, right? So how do, when we're in these conversations, and I'm sure you're speaking frequently with European counterparts, what are sort of the legal, are the legal alignments and the legal obstacles there?
Well, I think there are so many, it's almost hard to list. But if you have built the infrastructure of the American agencies working together, we expect to be able to announce very shortly that there is significantly increased funding for the klepto-capture joint enterprise and to support the transatlantic task force. Assuming that proves out to be true, then a lot of the resource problem goes away. As you know from having served in government, resources move towards attention. Yeah. And where this has world attention and presidential attention and press attention, I think that's highly motivating within agencies. So I think we'll see a lot of alacrity in that response. And then once you've built out the kind of command center, then you can figure out how you parse through targeting individual assets and figuring out the best strategy to freeze and seize that asset and proceed against the oligarch behind it. But it's all being done in a much more systematized, organized, and priority-driven way rather than, again, episodically and sporadically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, do you think that there will be, any aptitude? I mean, clearly there's a consensus about Russia, but do you think that there's going to be much more of a political will to go after kleptocrats and oligarchs in more friendly jurisdictions?
I think once you've set up the machinery, and once you have the understanding that kleptocracy and oligarchy everywhere is a threat to national security for us, then it just becomes a question of who do you target next? But I think this is God's work in the sense that when you have criminal regimes looting their countries so that the people of that country don't have good water, don't have good roads, don't have good hospitals, don't have the basic resources for civilized human existence because they've been robbed by the people who are nominally in charge of them. And when you can undo that corrupt superstructure that is looting the country, and with any luck, actually return assets to that country so that they can actually start building the schools and the roads and the highways and the hospitals, that's a huge win for America and for rule of law and for humankind. So I just don't see this slowing down. We're in the fast water of where history wants us to go in terms of cleaning up all this criminality and kleptocracy.
Mm-hmm. What about Ukrainian oligarchs?
Well, they've had their own reckoning to a significant degree already. And I don't know where the situation in Ukraine ends right now, but I think there'll be even further reckoning in the days ahead. I don't want to make exemptions for anybody. I think corrupt oligarchy anywhere is a national security danger and needs to be addressed. It usually is born in corruption, and then the resources are used to create and propagate further corruption. And none of that corruption is good for our brand. None of it is good for the kind of market economics that we adhere to in this country. And none of it is good for the advance of democracy and freedom around the world. Those are pretty high goals of ours.
What would you, again, what if we start this and then, we hit a wall, right? Because we've tried, we have a lot of wind behind us now. We have a lot of financial resources. We at least have the political buy-in from our closest partners, but it turns out it's really way too hard right now, right? Because the business interests are too entrenched. These guys own critical industries, right? That's a lot of stuff that we have with sanctioning, as we find out that they own a major industry and be bankrupting a whole sector, right? How much of this is actually going to be, do you think, is a tenable sort of, it's almost a business model, right?
Yeah.
To ask global economies whose Greece really is corruption to adopt, right?
Yeah.
It is a new concept. In the US, we have our better angels and then we fail at them sometimes, but we have that, right? But for some countries in the world, right, their economies run in a certain way, right?
And we are going to have to prioritize, and we are going to have to perform in an effective manner. We can't blunder and foul things up. We've got to avoid mistakes and prepare well and all of that. But I think a world in which we've decided through the Democracy Initiative that kleptocracy has to be diminished and rooted out, and where we have a robust klepto capture combined organization in the country to effect that purpose, and are coordinating well with other rule of law nations through the transatlantic task force to expand that effort and multiply that effort. I would rather be in that world, even if we're not getting it all at once, and even if we have to pick our targets as this thing develops, than I would be in a world in which this is just running rampant and we're on the receiving end of all the evil that the oligarchs generate. And that's been the situation that we've been in. I'd rather be on offense than sitting there just having to deal with the consequences of not cleaning this up.
Mm-hmm. What do you think some of
Quality
our
problem to have, right?
No, it's a good problem to have. No, and I'm fully behind it. I'm an eternal optimist. What do you think that that some of our geopolitical challengers think when they see this? Do you think that it's something that I mean, there are, the Russian government says we are targeting internal corruption. The Chinese government says that too. They mean it in a certain way, right? They clean up domestic corruption, but do they see it the same way that we do, especially when we put it in national security terminology and direct it at them?
I don't think so. And I think when they see this happening, particularly if it is a combined effort by rule of law nations, and let's just say that we make it as unacceptable for any nation to secrete dark money from kleptocrats, criminals, and oligarchs as it would be for that country to use child labor, that it's just not acceptable any longer, and it doesn't matter who you are. You may not run non-transparent financial systems any longer and be part of the rule of law community. Then I think a lot of things begin just naturally to tip in our direction. And I think immediately the kleptocratic regimes start to think, oh, expletive deleted, my business model just took a real dent, and this is not a good thing. And we want them to think that way and feel that way because we want to put them on their heels and try to revert to open market, democracy, transparent, and accountable world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's certainly a lofty goal. I mean, I think that one of my concerns here, so broader from an academic perspective, looking at this crisis, right, is the overwhelming use of financial and economic tools as our point of leverage. Going after kleptocrats through, in many ways, is another one of those, right? And so, how much do you think that the U.S. is the U.S. use of these tools is appropriate? Are we at a risk of sort of not putting our money where our mouth is, overextending ourselves? And where does that sort of balance in other elements of American power?
I think there's some dangers, particularly if China decides to build basically a competing economic system based on its currency and following rule of law light and trying to take advantage of kleptocrats everywhere to bring their money under their system and compete with us, the dollar, as the dominant currency. But I think at the end of the day, we just have so much advantage through our economic system, through our market competitiveness, through our liberal democracy values, even diminished or dinged as they may be, that I think we end up winning that battle. And I do think that people, from a human perspective, they want to be part of the global economy. They want to have a credit card that works. They want to be able to go to a fancy resort with their family. They want their kids to be able to go to a fancy boarding school in Switzerland or whatever. And the more of those things we cut off so that they see that they're isolated, and no matter how much they stole, if you can't spend it on the stuff you want, it's just numbers. And so the more we can put that pressure on them and have people understand that if you want to play in rule of law land, you got to live by rule of law rules, and you're not right now. I think that's a huge corrective. So I'm very enthusiastic about what we're doing. And I think the support of the corporate private sector has also been very helpful. MasterCard and Visa saying we're done with our Russian cards, Apple no longer updating your phone over there. If automobiles, no more spare parts, all of that begins to really pile up in people's lives.
Mm-hmm. But not only in oligarchs' lives, right? So, I mean, I think that one of the sort of tragedies of sanctions is that we affect everybody, right?
Yeah.
mean, 2014,
Yeah.
this is what I came to the Treasury Department, was like the idea and the sanctions, we were going to peel the oligarchs off of Putin. We were going to leave the rest of the Russian economy intact because we didn't want to affect the Russian people. We even encouraged US businesses to go work with the real economy versus the Kremlin economy. But now we've shifted to, let's wreak as much damage as we can on Russia as quickly as possible, right?
Yeah.
The US businesses are pulling out, not just because it looks bad for them. I think that's part of it, but part of it is just they can't operate there anymore.
Yeah.
They have to cut their losses. What do you think the long-term implications are of doing what we just did to Russia? I think.
Well, first of all, I think one has to be sympathetic to the fact that the economic pressure we're putting on Russia is going to extend beyond just wealthy oligarchs. And there will be economic repercussions for ordinary Russians. But if you put that up against the repercussions that we're seeing right now on ordinary Ukrainians who have to flee their countries, who have rockets fired into their apartment buildings, who are watching their neighbors killed with indiscriminate shelling of cities, there's a huge sympathy gap. And to a certain extent, it's just tough bounce, right? I mean, those are the tools that we have. And I think that we can be quite adaptive in how much we use these tools. Just because there's a corrupt autocrat in a country doesn't mean that the next thing we do is we go wipe out their economy. This is a unique circumstance in which a dictator has launched a land war in Europe, shelling civilians, and that is about as unacceptable behavior in the world community as you could possibly have. You can dial this up and you can dial this down to what is appropriate. And I think in many circumstances, the targeting of the oligarchs can be very precise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it absolutely can be. I think that it is a central part of it. We're just a couple minutes left. And I want to give you obviously a chance to make any final statement you'd like, but do you think that this is a moment of, optimistically speaking, an opening for greater bipartisanship in other areas? Russia's always been a good one.
Yeah, and a lot of this was conceived in the bipartisan Munich Security Conference delegation. Senator Graham has been extremely forward-leaning about going after the oligarchs, and I think the delegation itself and Congress more generally has had a very strong bipartisan message to the administration, which is, we're with you, go get them. What can we do to help you? So I think this is very, very solid and shows the world America speaking as America, not America speaking through our partisan squabbles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there anything else I have missed and not asked you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're looking at a few more things. We want to extend the anti-money laundering beyond banks to other groups that are now heavily used for money laundering purposes, like hedge funds and real estate and so forth. I think better reporting of particularly high-end assets in real estate and yachting and aircraft. We're hectoring the Coast Guard to implement the rule requiring disclosure as the beneficial owner of vessels, which they were obliged to do, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, and just never bothered to get around to doing. So this is a little bit of an embarrassing moment for them to have to explain why they didn't do what they were told to do when they were told to do it. But I expect that will get cleaned up. I think there's a lot of good progress that is happening now because of this, and it's an inspiring and it's a bright moment in a world in which there's a lot of dark stuff happening.
And what else can we do on the outside, from think tanks or the cadre of fantastic investigative journalists who focus on this stuff?
I think just keep emphasizing the human decency and national security aspects of this that matter to America's brand. What did Bill Clinton like to say? The power of our example has always mattered more than any example of our power. And this is a good moment for us to reclaim example, and not only us, but all the rule of law nations. And I think that's important to remember, because there are a lot of people, including fellow citizens, who make a lot of money servicing this kleptocrat economy. And we have seen them turn on political interference organizations like the Chamber and the American Bar Association and the NFIB to try to defend themselves. So, we just have to be alert to making sure that people understand that this really matters, and we've got to get it done and get it done right. And that the people who are aiding and abetting the hiding of assets by criminals and autocrats and kleptocrats are doing a grave disservice to their own country and are not the people we should be defending in this contest.
Agreed. We're at time. Senator, thank you so much for spending 45 minutes with us on your busy schedule. It's always a pleasure to have you here. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, so both the Eurasia Center and the Geoeconomic Center, I want to thank you all for joining us. Senator, thank you for all of your work on this issue, and we stand ready to help.
And thank you for yours. Thank you for yours.